into what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
So, yeah, there was a massive storm last night. And yeah, it was super loud, super rainy. And then I woke up this morning, I looked at Instagram, and there's like a queer club, bar, community space here in Coventry. And they have a big like gazebo outside. And they had put the CCTV footage of the gazebo landing on a person. And then they said something like, oh, nobody was harmed. A pint fixes everything.
When you introduced the idea of this as the cold open, you did not talk about CCTV footage.
Wait, I want to see. Let me see if I can find it, and then you can live react.
Because I was just like, before we started recording, I was talking about how, I come from Puerto Rico where we actually have hurricanes. And then I've lived through tornadoes. So I was like, oh, wind in this country? Nothing. And then it actually left. Okay.
Wait till it falls. See what I mean? Like it fully lands on them and they're like, lol.
Is it an employee? Does no one know?
I have no idea. Because if it's not an employee, like what is going on?
I have a lot of opinions about queer clubs here in Coventry. And I will say they're living up to everything I think of them.
Anyway, with that as the cold open, this is our author interview, and we've got two special guests. So we've got J. Daniel Luther, who is the author of the book that we're reading, and we have Roshan, who helped on the book.
So the book is titled Queering Normativity and South Asian Public Culture, Wrong Readings Only, which is a fantastic title. And with that, you guys can take it away. Please introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Paula and Hannah. It's so good to be here with both of you. And I'm such a big fan of the Theoryish podcast. So I'm excited to be here. I do a lot of long drives between Oxford and London. And so your podcast might go to to listen to while I'm doing those drives. So just know you have a big fan. Yeah, so I'm Daniel. I finished this book and it came out in 2023 in November. And this book is kind of based on my PhD research that I was doing when I was at SOAS. Finished that research in 2019. And just to think about it, right? 2014 is when this research started and 2023 is when the book comes out. That's like 9 years of just trying to get this thing out in the world. But I'm super excited that it's out in the world and really excited about having this conversation with all of you. So yeah, that's me. And, I'm so glad that Roshan is here to chat about the book as well. Roshan worked with me on the book project.
Hi, thanks for having me, Paula and Hannah. And of course, thank you for the invite, Daniel. And my name is Roshan. I'm still doing my master's degree. I'm doing a master's in English, but it was really, I would say, an amazing opportunity to be able to sit down and be a part of someone's first monograph, and especially a project that spanned almost a decade. And I think it was really eye-opening for me working in a field that I'm so passionate about and getting to get an insight into something that is so well thought of, that has taken so much critical insight. So yeah, hoping that everyone else who reads this has a lot to learn and take from it.
Thank you both. So if we could have a little bit of an introduction to the book, so what it was about, what you want people to get out of it, I guess. So yeah.
So I think when I started off thinking about it as a PhD research project, I had no idea that it was going to be this book. And I have to tell you, I was trying to get the publishers to go with the subtitle as the main title. So I wanted it to be Wrong Readings Only and then whatever else, Queering Normativity. But they were like, no, that's never going to be searchable. And then nobody will want the book. And I'm like, okay, fine. I give up. But the book was kind of like just this project that really was born out of frustration, trying to figure out in many ways parts of my identity that sort of encountered systems, people, practices that always made it feel kind of left of center or very, very left of center. No idea why I'd always kind of feel in the wrong. And I was just like, there must be some sort of explanation for it. So the PhD project wasn't specifically like, oh, I want to be a queer theorist. I actually, when I was growing up in India, I had no idea that there was a thing called queer theory that existed. And we could go into that. I think at some point when I moved to Singapore, that's when I was like, oh, what is this weird, interesting field called queer theory that I have never heard anything about? Anyway, I digress. So the book kind of like looks at an engagement with what we understand as quote unquote the normal in South Asian public culture and how that normal has come to be. What are its contours in terms of gender and sexuality and caste? And we can talk about caste, particularly in the South Asian context, and how that sort of shapes a default position for most people who are growing up in various South Asian cultures that result in any deviance being kind of constantly policed or constantly self-policed or constantly labeled as, inadequate, inaccurate, wrong, which was why I wanted it to be called Wrong Readings Only, blah, 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 the rest. But here we are. And so the book is kind of like a thematic exploration of gender and sexuality and the ways in which that sort of a certain strain of that sort of informs what we understand as the normal in South Asian public culture. And it looks at nationalism. It looks at sort of how the colonial encounter shaped the nationalist movement in many ways to produce a certain kind of gendered and sexual subject or a certain kind of normal, quote unquote, gender and sexual subject. Sorry, I should say this. Every time I say the word normal, I'm always talking about it in scare quotes because it scares me. But yeah. And then like it goes into more contemporary sort of instances. I think Bollywood plays a big part in informing how people consume images, representation, and what are the sort of the contours of that. So there's a chapter on Bollywood right at the end. There's some chapters that are on popular literature texts. There's a lot of ephemera in there because I'm like, how do I do this strange thing where I'm tracing how the normal is shaped and formed? And there are no archives to go to because they don't like have the museum of normal things, right? They just have a museum and you go be like, where's the other stuff? Where's the stuff that doesn't fit here? So for me, it was such an interesting kind of challenge to find an archive that would pull together an archive that would allow me to study how the normal functions, how it works as a power structure to shape us, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I think the biggest takeaway from it would be, people being aware of how this works and using it to question everything rather than, going off of just like almost default common sense. Because I think at some point the normal slips into the commonsensical and, you hear it all over the place. That's how I open the introduction, where it's like, oh, boys should be boys. And why don't we stop and say, but why? Or what is a boy? What do you mean? And that kind of stuff. So yeah, I hope that's like some sort of intro to the book.
No, absolutely. And I think you even like just this introduction is setting up a lot of the terms that we're even going to be discussing with normativity, and a term I forgot to include in our little structure, which is your use of the word slippage and how things just tend to fall into each other, which I thought was a really refreshing thing to read in a subject on ephemera, on pop culture, on these items that we all have either in our homes or have consumed, or even just look at as a poster, and how in our brains we kind of are formulating our own little archive and ideas of what it means to have these things occupy space.
Yeah, I mean, where do you want us to go? I can go straight into slippage if you want.
Hannah, do you want to go through the chapters or?
So I think we can do it all together and then just like draw from the chapters we need. I guess, I mean, me and Paula have an understanding of the word caste, but I think if you could define that, that'd be really helpful for the audience perspective, for people who might not know or might want to understand your understanding of it. And then I think if we go into the word slippage, and then we can go and unpack normativity.
Yeah, sounds good. And I also wanted to bring Roshan into this discussion on caste. And actually, I'm curious to also understand how you understand the word caste. So we could come to that as well. So I think in some ways, talking about caste in South Asia has some equivalences to talking about it in terms of race in Western contexts, but caste has implication or is connected in many ways to the ways in which religious societies are structured in South Asia, particularly Hinduism, but it's not exclusive to Hinduism. In fact, castes are also almost silently in unspoken ways are part and parcel of the ways in which Christians in South Asia structure society. And I remember there is a section in one of the chapters that talks about how, casteism is deeply implicated in Syrian Christians and the way in which they structure society. There's also sort of its tie in to various professions historically in South Asia and works on a fundamental structure where there's a hierarchy within society where priestly classes and so on are seen as the most upper caste, centered around rites of purity and impurity, leading to practices like untouchability for people who are within that system demarcated as belonging to the lowest of castes, which also include professions, sort of almost like you're born into that profession and there is no way that you can do anything different. And society is structured in such a way that caste hierarchy is constantly replicated. So you'd go to schools and, people who are belonging to a low caste would be treated differently in the same classroom as compared to people who belong to a upper class, and teachers would practice sort of all kinds of discriminatory things. But this is not just like schools, it's socially built into the fabric of the ways in which the government operates, the ways in which justice is accessible to people, even though we have a constitution in India, particularly that is, centered around anti-caste practices and equality. So let me pause there, and Roshan, please add to what I've said.
Yeah, just adding to what Daniel had to say, and I think one of the biggest things that plagues the caste system is that it's anything but homogeneous, in the sense that, of course, there's class-based distinction, but then caste in itself has several distinctions. So there are scheduled castes, there are scheduled tribes, and these span across, I would say, factors like geography, factors like economic class. So it can be someone who is multiply oppressed, both by class and caste, someone who might have generationally recovered from economic backwardness, but still face the stigma of being born in a certain caste. And something as simple as a surname is indicative of caste. And there are much more, how do I put it, if they're subtle or overt, but food eating practices, clothing habits, all of these indicate caste. And these are cultural practices which one cannot just give up and perhaps aspire for social mobility. So it's a very sticky situation that one navigates. And especially today, I believe in urban India, I see many scholars today writing that caste is often spoken of in idioms of class hierarchy. In urban settings, there are several units now, segments now, who perhaps do not think that they're participating in caste hierarchy, but there is an implicit bias which informs understanding. Something as simple as domestic work and house help, they are often almost, how do I put this, by default looked as someone hailing from a lower caste. And this also sort of has seeped in today into the popular imaginary. We see several OTT productions now, and there's just, I think, sort of the more, I would say, pressing concerns of how caste is spoken of and understood today, which probably could be of a site of interest.
Thank you. Yeah, We can talk about it later because I was thinking about, I think it's chapter 4 where you're talking about like the matrimonial adverts and yeah.
Before we started recording, we were talking about our understanding of caste. And I just remembered that I used to work for an architecture department and a lot of our students were from India. And it was an actual issue that we had once where I had to explain the academic conduct to a couple students because I didn't understand it at the time, but now that it's being explained, I was like, oh, it was a group of students from one university versus a student from a completely different university, and they were not behaving accurately with each other based on last name, based on all these other things that I had no cultural insight to. And, I had to come in and basically go, absolutely not. So I thought it was really interesting, especially now that we're going to go deeper into these representations of caste and these slippages into ephemera and media on things that are very, I think, obvious to someone in India, but from us, we're complete outsiders. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for explaining it because I felt very uncultured.
Great. I actually just one quick shout on that in the US. I think it was in February last year that maybe it was Seattle, where sort of Seattle was the first cities to explicitly ban caste-based discrimination in the US. So I think there's a whole conversation in the US that's been happening for a while now. And I think there's progress there on working on anti-caste or banning caste-based discrimination. So I think maybe California is also considering it and stuff. So, people in the US could definitely plug into that conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so slippage, just coming back to this, I think it was so interesting when I was thinking about how do we try and sort of pin down the ways in which the normal sort of is working. When you ask for a rationale for something that everyone's assuming and taken for granted, people tend to like not have a reason or not have thought about it. It's just like, oh, it's almost like, oh, this is how the way things were. This is how it's done. Oh my God, a total sidebar, and I'll come back to slippage. On Monday, I was in London attending a queer comedy show, which was really fun. It was this queer US Malaysian comic whose name is Ricky. So shout out to Ricky, whose show was titled Coming Out to Dead People. And he was talking about how it was such a difficult thing to navigate his own coming out while his mom was going through a really difficult terminal illness and then succumbed later to that. And in that, at some point, and like it was part really funny and part really sad, and I think I laughed and cried, and some of it was at the same time, and I'm like, oh my God, am I a horrible person for laughing? But also, why am I crying right now? It's crazy. But one of the things that he said to me, and that really just stuck with me, was that he said, tradition is just intergenerational bullying. And I was like, oh my God. But I think it's almost like that's how I think about it. Like when you're trying to pin down this thing that's the normal, that you can't find in a particular place, you can't understand how it's shaping everything, you don't know where to go to look for it. There's almost like any question to ask is like either the question shut down or it's like one, sort of unthought of adage after the next. And so I was like, how is it managing to escape being pinned down? Like, why is this like contrary logic not being talked about? And so I landed on the word slippage, of course, drawing from, the work of Derrida and Spivak and so on in thinking about the word slippage. But I was like, there's almost something here where trying to pin something down is impossible, particularly in relation to the normal when it masquerades as common sense. And what we're ending up with is a discourse slipping into another discourse to sort of distract. It's almost like, I don't know if any of you are fans of Drag Race, but there's this drag queen, in that mock presidential debate. And I'm like, all politics is like this right now, where they go, look over there. It's literally that. Look over there. Right? That's how I think about slippage in this case, because you ask, why should boys not be boys? And they're like, look over there. What are these people doing to X people or whatever? So yeah, the way in which I'm using slippage is to talk about these impossibility of pinning this discourse down, to subject it to examination and scrutiny, and to expose its logical fallacies. And in trying to trace down the normal, and I borrow from Foucault and Foucauldian scholars on this, David Halper and so on thinking about what are the components of the normal. So the normal is not just, whatever it is that's on the surface, but it's also made up of these layers where there are these injunctions that are laden with power that come with the threat of violence, which Foucault has called normativity. And I borrow that. And then there's normalization, where we're automatically internalizing those power structures and being like, right, this is the way it's supposed to be. Tradition, right? Intergenerational bullying. This is this is what we're always been doing. This is what we'll always keep doing. So yeah.
The drag queen that you were talking about was Jada Essence Hall, because I really enjoyed that episode. That was very funny. But I think it's really pivoting away from who we put our focus on when we are studying anything, perhaps. So when we look at the normal, it's always a question of who is getting oppressed, what is the method of oppression, and what is the method of reparation. But really putting the normal in the hot seat brings a new way of thinking about what is the agent and how do we unsettle this. As a queer person, if I'm reading a chapter from your book, I feel finally I'm not in the hot seat, and I do not have to give explanations. I don't have to build a repertoire of reasons why I'm valid, but I'm questioning why you're rational against me is even something that should be put up.
So just to add on to that, Roshan, and thanks for while you were talking, this line from, I don't even know which page it is. I have a photographic memory. So when I look at it, I'm like, oh, I could flip through a book and find the page almost, which is cool. I feel like it's a little superpower, but there's this page in Foucault's volume 1 of the History of Sexuality. And there's a line, which I'm not sure I'm quoting verbatim, but it is that, when this sort of Victorian morality and the disciplinary functions were coming into being, about people having to stand up and articulate who they were for systems of governance that Foucault later calls biopower in one of his other lectures. For the first time in a long time, everyone else had to come and stand in front of this disciplinary mechanism, whatever form and shape it takes, whether it's the court systems or whether it's the health or whatever it is, stand in front of these disciplinary mechanisms and articulate who they were. But it granted the quote unquote heterosexual normal couple the secrecy and privacy of their bedroom. And and there's a line in my book that talks about this, where I'm like, I'm not interested in looking at the effects or the symptoms of the cause. I'm interested in looking at the cause. And what we have with sort of liberatory discourse is that we're constantly fighting one symptom of the effect, and then from one to the next, right? Whether we're fighting caste, whether we're fighting gender oppression, whether we're fighting sexuality-based oppression or disability-based oppression, or body images, we're not looking at the cause. The cause is, in some ways, the way in which Foucault frames it, and other Foucauldian scholars talk about it, is the way in which there's an assumed set of things that become the normal, and that assumption around it is what causes all of these problems. So I'm just targeting almost in that inquiry throughout the book the assumption and the basis of that assumption.
Yeah, your book makes it very obvious that you're kind of fighting against this sort of national hegemony of this is how you're supposed to function, this is how you're supposed to represent yourself. And where I think I want our listeners to sort of start questioning, and what I would like more info on, is the point then, if you are queer persons, do you function within that? I know this is a very obvious question, but do you function within that normativity, or are you meant to fight it, sort of that Eldeminian fight of that queer normative space, or I don't know, a queer utopia creation within outside of normativity then? Because that's sort of been the question that's been roaming around post-Foucault in Western academic circles. But how does this then translate over to India, where the conversations are now being had?
Yeah, no, there's definitely a bunch of things in there, Paula. And I think one thing maybe I should kind of start with is just a caveat around sort of the way in which we view time as linear, partially because I feel like these questions in many ways have been asked by different people in South Asian contexts. And in fact, I think the chapter that Roshan and I were writing after this actually talks about this poet Kamala Das, whose autobiography called My Story came out the same year. Correct me if I'm wrong, Roshan, the same year that Foucault's History of Sexuality came out in French. So it was not even translated. And she wrote in English. And she was already talking about, like, she uses the word queerness in English. She actually used the word queernesses in English to talk about how she didn't have the freedom to be in many ways. And, I thought long and hard about including Kamala Das's work in this book, but I think it's for a subsequent book, actually. But yeah, so coming back to that question, like, I think, these questions have been asked. And I think chapter 1, sort of around Tagore, talks a little bit about how Tagore is sort of, in a way, being instrumentalized or utilized in these different ways by national frameworks and national hegemonies, and, how they're co-opting progressive discourses. But the main question that you were asking, and I don't think anyone is born out of or sort of is kind of functioning in a system where the normal, whatever that might be, is not part and parcel of the cultural milieu in which they're functioning. There would be different ways in which whatever that normal is different. So I feel like there's no sort of utopic escape from normativity. I don't think that a future imagines exists. Maybe somewhere else in another dimension. I don't know. But when we encounter these things constantly, and that's where the methodology goes, right? It's constantly encountering, finding yourself being wrong, and actually learning what are the questions to ask and what are the pitfalls to be aware of. Because when you ask those questions, you will then encounter the force of normativity, right? The power systems, whether they are punitive. And I've kind of listed them in some ways, these could be like as punitive as violence against people who are, different in many ways. Trans people, queer people growing up in families, you could be locked in rooms and threatened and all kinds of things, taken to doctors, quack doctors to sort of cure you. And then there's like simple but banal violence. It's like you go to your family wedding function and they're like, oh, you're the only unmarried one. Why aren't you getting married? We'll find a suitable ex opposite gender for you, right? To get married to. Or it's like the gossip. And it's embedded in structurally in systems, right? You get tax breaks for being married. I'm sorry, single people are the most oppressed people on the planet, right? Why are you paying so much money just because you're single? Sorry, what happened here? Who decided that this heterosexual couple is going to be the dominant marker and our entire social legal system is going to be centered around them? In some ways, in the text, I was trying to work with the problem, and Judith Butler was really helpful in thinking this through in The Psychic Life of Power, because I think in some ways, encountering the normal is a dissonant act. It's a dissonant set of contradictions that constantly force the subject or the self to sort of question everything, to be like, what's happening? How am I being gaslit by this system or these ways of thinking? And so I try to use, actually borrowed from Sedgwick. I said, okay, you know what? Let's take these as axiomatic. So I have 2 axioms in the book that I actually constantly test within these different cases. So the first axiom is that normativity makes invisible its own production. So like, rather than getting into the argument or falling prey to the slippage, right? Let's just say that normativity is making its own production invisible, because the minute you jump from one set of discourses to the next, you've lost track of what's causing that jump. You're just focused on what the discourse is focusing on. So I, sort of borrow from Sedgwick to do that. And David Halperin, on the privileged invisibility of heterosexuality, and it's calling that privileged invisibility into question constantly. And then the second axiom that I used was that the potency of normativity lies not in its operation as an external force, but actually in its internalization by subjects, right? So how can, and take an example, so chapter 3 actually does this, where it talks about the failings of feminisms in South Asia, particularly over the course of the independence movement in South Asia. And when I say South Asia, I include pre-partition South Asia. So that includes countries that are now Pakistan, now India, now Bangladesh, and what have you. And I draw on Michael Warner to ask, why is it important for people to be normal? So talking about this internalization by subjects and taking that as axiomatic, like I'm like, let's just accept that we've all kind of been brought into this system in some way or the other with other kinds of differences, and we're just figuring it out from there. And this book is trying to get you to figure it out together, to see the slippage, because the minute you see the slippage, right, it's like seeing a traffic light. You're like, oh, green means go. And Roshan, love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think coming back to the question that Paula posed, I guess we all have our own relationships with what the normal is and what normativity is and how we structure our lives through it. And Daniel uses this distinction between anti normative and contra normative. And I think the book really is sort of a spotlight on how queer living can perhaps be contra living. And it's important to recognize these pockets that allows one to sort of take a step back, look at the ways things plays out, and question the inquisitiveness of just knowing things around you and how they function. And there's also something that runs throughout the book, but on the section where Daniel speaks about R. Raj Rao and their personal politics, someone who has had access to academic knowledge, but at the same time, what they make out of it and their particular active resistance of not becoming a popular author or of actively resisting something which becomes completely individual, something which they do not feel is necessary to be made into a standard, to made into a norm, a normal. And yeah, really, I think that is a place where we see how queerness and how today the relationship with normativity evolves. Also, another thing that comes to my mind today when we're thinking about queerness is neoliberalization and the entire discourse around neoliberal co-option, and is the queer subject even alive? Is there radical politics alive? And perhaps there's not an easy answer to this, and we really need to sit over it and mull it over.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that to say that when I'm using the word queer, and I think Roshan pointed this out as well just now when talking about anti-normativity versus contra-normativity, and it speaks a little bit to your question as well. I'm very conscious about the ways in which queer is co-opted by neoliberal discourse, by like popular everyday discourse, where it's just become an identity. So I'm very, very mindful of using queer as a verb throughout the text, and drawing on, work like work by Janet Jacobson and others. And I think there's this I remember there's an episode of yours in your podcast where you talk about bell hooks. And there was this whole section on love as a verb, and I was like, oh yeah, totally, and there's so many balances there. But just coming back to that, almost like queer as a verb allows us to decenter an identity in many ways that can seem Western. Although I would, automatically just contest that based on the fact that, without having read Kamala Das, who was writing around the time of Foucault, can we call queer Western? And actually, that's less interesting a question, whether queer is Western or not, or etc. But actually, why are we so interested in this question of Westernizing queer? What does it serve? Who does it serve, rather? And what nationalist forces are constantly holding on to power by doing that? Whereas, when I look at it and I look at acts that are contrary to what seems to be predominantly the normal in that context. And I do this in various different chapters. And Roshan gave the example of Professor R. Raj Rao, who I interviewed for fieldwork, who, sort of is kind of practicing this queerness as a verb in many facets of his life. And some of his work is really incredible, including his novels and poetry and all of that. So, the anti-normative is where you're suturing together a set of practices that are conscious of the way in which normativity functions and how it sort of imposes itself on subjects, whether they're queer or not, it doesn't matter, right? It imposes itself on heterosexuality. And I think in chapter 1, I talk about Rabindranath Tagore's texts, and I talk about all of his, sort of heroines in his novels, where they're all like following non-standard sexual practices, contextually specific non-standard sexual practices, right? So let's name that, because what could be non-standard in the medieval era is very different from what could be non-standard now. So, contextually specific non-standard practices without an awareness of how sort of normativity is working, or what normativity is and how it's structuring our behavior, right? Because it is in that way axiomatic that normativity is internalized by subjects. Then there are anti-normative acts where it's like, I actually know how this works. I'm understanding how the system has worked to, disenfranchise single people, put a premium on being a couple. Can you rent a house? Can you get married? Who can you live with? Get all those wedding gifts, intergenerational wealth transfer, not just intergenerational bullying, right? And the ways in which those anti-normative practices then are in some ways a queer practice rather than just an identity where I just kind of LGBTQ plus, because the balances that it has are very different. And chapter 4 does this, where it's like, it talks about how queer people can be casteist and the ways in which that caste oppression continues, where in the same way you can talk about how queer people can be racist and how queer people can be misogynist, but is that a queer practice, or is that co-opting progressive identity for, DEI related benefits? I don't know.
I was thinking about it when you were talking about Munoz, and then I kind of was thinking about it when you were both talking around this idea of like constantly unsettling. And I guess that's the point of questioning normativity, right? So Munoz talks about, I haven't read it in a while, it's going to be my next chapter thing, but it's all about, this idea of like, we are not yet queer, we're striving for something that we may never reach. And so this idea of like constantly unsettling normativity, I see it as like doing a similar thing, right? Like it's constantly not allowing the norm to reestablish itself in the same ways, or it's making clear how certain things happen to allow people to make their own decisions, right? If you go, okay, these are the logics behind what is happening, now you can make your own decision, And then when you were talking about queer, when you were saying, is queer Western, why are we actually interested in that? It kind of reminds me in my own work of this notion of like constantly trying to pin queer down so you can use it to either refute certain things or support certain things. And actually, there's a quote from like my research where somebody says, we're all talking about the same thing, like, why are we arguing? And so I see it as like a similar thing, like, yeah, so those are my kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, just coming to the why are we like, it's almost like taxonomy, right? Trying to pin queer down, but that taxonomy is a long-standing, for lack of a better word, and I almost treat it as a trigger word now. It's a long-standing tradition, right, of Western systems of categorizing, labeling, and so many academics have talked about it, so many historians have talked about it, the colonial process in the sex gender system of just, taxonomy. And I think that whole desire to pin queer down is susceptible to that taxonomy. But if we look at the taxonomy and we're like, what anxiety is this taxonomy actually serving? That's the question I'm interested in. I'm like, not what the taxonomy is. The other day I went to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Just to describe it, it's kind of like you walk into this, a room which has many floors, and there's just like archaeological artifacts from all over the place in like glass boxes, and it's just like crammed in there. It's like you're walking into an anthropologist's wet dream. right? It's like, oh my God, there's everything there. And everything's kind of like being taxonomized or is part of this process of being taxonomized. And I'm like, what is this anxiety answering? Because that's a very anxious space. Like I walked in and I'm like, I can see all these objects belonging to different cultures in this room crammed together with no like sort of sense of their respect for whatever they symbolize in different cultures. They're just all there, you know. And some plaques do a little bit more justice to some stuff and some don't. And, you know, this includes like indigenous people's artifacts from cultures. It includes, you know, tribes. It includes contemporary culture. It's everything. And I'm just like, oh, I can see this. There's a lot of value in it. But like, what anxiety is this serving? You know, and I think that question around pinning queer down, I think the more interesting question is not like what is queer or what is not queer and et cetera, et cetera. Actually, what anxiety is this serving? Is this also part of that the normal that then allows the focus to be the queer and not, hang on a second, you know, your practices are not standard either. And you know, just to go back to kind of the law in some ways, and you know, part of the role that the law plays in this colonial cis-sex gender system is to impose order on different cultures, and British colonial law has had a lot to do with that across the world. But if you just read the letter of the law as it was written in 1860, when Thomas Babington Macaulay, I always believe in knowing and naming your enemies, no matter how dead they may be. You know, the anxiety that it serves is around thinking about what it took to put those words into the law, right? It's Section 377 reads, you know, unnatural offenses. Whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished. And then so on, the penalties. But actually, that in itself is open to so many non-standard practices, because what is the order of nature, what are unnatural, and who's defining this are all part of the anxieties that are being spoken to. In this case, pinning queer down means, according to the quote-unquote traditional definition of what is unnatural, like giving blowjob to your heterosexual partner is unnatural because that's against the order of nature. So technically, lock up all the all the blowjob givers as well, right? If you're going to do that. So yeah, I think it's kind of the pinning of queer down is almost a distraction from the real question.
And yeah, it goes into like the purpose of governance then, where like, when the laws change, then what becomes normative and what becomes queer then starts to sort of change and move and morph. Thinking of like, you know, when gay marriage bill passed in the US, what is then non-normative about queerness if it's just been checked off by a government structure, or a government employee stands in the way of your marriage or of your gay divorce, whatever you want to do. So I can see why the Foucault is really deep in there. And then like that between the line stuff with Derrida.
I do want to just like acknowledge, because I was going to do it at the start and then I forgot, that the way you think about the normativity, normalization was so helpful, by the way. So just for our like audience's point of view, if they ever actually want to understand this as a topic, I highly recommend. Like that first chapter you gave us was just so instructive and inspiring. And like when you were saying at the beginning, like going back to the question, not staying with the thing itself, but like going back to like why are we constantly questioning, like super helpful. I'm currently writing my PhD and I'm like, this is incredible. I need to go back in. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Paula, I don't know if you were going to...
Thank you.
I was going to say, I really wanted to talk about the archive itself, because we were talking about normativity, been talking about what it represents, what it stands for, but I am really interested to see then your usage of what should be in the archive. Is the archive a physical manifestation where you would go, or is the archive something maybe that we all have, or something that is more of a thought? And also, how does this then go into these processes of what to keep and who gets to dictate what belongs there, especially since earlier we talked about caste and representations of queerness in different castes. Then how does that function within an archive?
So I think let me talk about a problem that I had while I was trying to think about this archive, because I was like, this is a whole set of it's almost like a Rubik's cube. I have no idea what goes where and how does it go there and what makes sense. And actually there are like fragments of chapters that I didn't write because sometimes I couldn't trace down like what the slippage led to. But almost like I allowed the slippage to lead me. I'm like, what is the cover that is being used to distract from this question? What is the disguise here? And so the first chapter really does that as an exemplar, because the first chapter works through how are we trying to think about a national sort of figure. And so I use Tagore as an example, but I think you could replace Tagore with anyone. You could replace Tagore with Lincoln. You could replace Tagore with Gandhi. You could replace Tagore with Beyonce. I don't know, but you'd get there, right? How are people using and defining a particularly palatable version of this figure in order to further their own purposes? And those purposes could be multifaceted, right? Those purposes could be, oh, look, I want my children to walk the straight and narrow because, hey, look, this great figure has done it. The purpose could be like, this is what our politics stand for, right? Why do figures like Joe Biden become more electable than other figures? Because that's the aspirational ideal. So in many ways, the archive is almost led by what's the slippage, because I'm like, what is being used as a distraction right now? How are we avoiding this real question about what is the normal and just constantly being unwilling and unrelenting on making the normal be the center of focus? So that's kind of how I was using the queer archive. I feel like I'm super indebted to all of these amazing, incredible people who have thought this through in many ways before, like Anjali Arondikar, whose work I really, really find really incredible. And, like her sort of thinking through of, what is going into the archive and the complexity of the archive. And what Derrida also calls about archive fever, right? Why are we interested in archive? And so the problem when I was doing my PhD at SOAS, people were asking me like, so what's your archive? Like, and I didn't get the question, right? It's almost like I'm trying to look at the normal. So I'm not sure how to answer this question right now. And it's almost like the history of SOAS. It's also the history of like British institutions where they're going to the colonies and they're interested in finding this archive that's going to be like, hey, here's the story of this backward tribe. Here's the story of this backward caste. Here's the story of XYZ. And now we know them so we can govern them. And my problem is that it's different. It's like, I don't know the story of this thing, but I only know the story of how it constantly makes me feel like I'm wrong, right? And so everyone's archive in that way, if you follow that methodology, is going to look different, because what makes you feel wrong is specific to how it works out, which is why my methodology is called wrong readings only. I'm like, I'm not interested in debating whether the reading is wrong or not. Here you go. It's wrong. Let's look at what the question really is now. I don't care. So for me, like other than Anjali, Gayatri Gopinath's work, Carl Schoonover, who was my examiner, and he's actually at Warwick. So those of you around Warwick should go say hey and give him this podcast. Rosalind Galt, who's at King's, so many people who've kind of like fought through these cultural formations that are in some ways, because we're dealing with something that is not the standard, not the normal, is always going to be diverse, disparate, not united together, right? You can't walk into the Museum of the Normal and find all of the things there. I've said this somewhere, like I think what I have as texts in the archive, cultural artifacts, can entirely be replaced by other cultural artifacts, and it may lead you to like very different questions, very interesting answers. And I hope people do that. But for me, I was kind of just focused on the ways in which I found that my subjectivity was constantly encountering this thing that was reading it as wrong. And I'm like, what is this thing? How do I look at this thing? But I have to almost like look at it askance, right? I can't look at it directly because it'll slip away. It's somewhere else before I know what happened. So, I kind of like looking at the erasures, the processes of erasures and the kinds of erasures that normativity performs, right? One on itself, because you can never look at it. It's already gone before you even take 2 seconds to look at it. And this is quite interesting. I remember someone whose work was looking at the gendering of toys, and we were talking about this question, and they were like, oh, it's a girl child and we have to give them a doll. And I was like, why? And they were like, but it has to be a pink doll. And I'm like, why? And the answers were just so multifacetedly inventive and creative without it being very simply, actually, I don't know, because that's the shit I internalized.
Yeah,
So,
your reply just reminded me there was a TikTok of a white mom having to explain why her daughter liked her black Barbie. She's like, I don't know, man. She just likes this Barbie. That's it. And the girl's just like having fun with the Barbie. So it's so interesting, I think, because I know Hannah and I off podcast and in the real world talk about what makes up an archive, what makes up a representation of queerness. For me personally, I don't think it exists because it's so many things at once. And it's also nothing at the same time. It can be anything from like a ticket to a concert to, I'm right across my record collection, and many things could be said about that collection and why I own it and all those things. So I think what I found really fascinating was your usage of pop culture and these items that I don't think people give a lot of value to, but are in fact a very palpable, touched, loved, or hated. There is an emotion attached to this, and how it sort of makes people counter their own normative stances. I think it was one of the examples you gave in chapter 4 with the cockroaches. Yeah, and I just, very, very Kafka-esque, obviously, but it was just one of those things where, it made me think of people's discomfort with things like Divine and Pink Flamingos, or these vestiges of queerness that are not meant to be comfortable, and how the archive can also be that emotional response. The archive is what makes your stomach hurt or queasy or uncomfortable, and maybe we can go more into that, the emotion attached to your work, because there is emotion here, and it's not just let's step away from normativity, but also how do we react and how do we feel as individuals?
yeah, no, great question. And I'd love to actually also hear Roshan on this. And I'll just say a few things, and then I'll pause, and then we can say more. I think one of the things that I was struggling with when I was trying to piece this research together for a book actually was striking a balance between it being an academic book and it being an accessible book. And I think the fraught piece of point over there is what you've named, it's emotion, right? Because this almost this pretense, and I talk a little bit about it right at the end in the conclusion, which I feel like is so insufficient. This pretense that this academic work cannot have emotion in it. And it's almost like the question is, what is this anxiety and who set it up for us? Because that's really interesting to me. And where is that person's therapist now? Right. But it's almost like it's also a question of disciplinarity, right? And Paula, Hannah, as you're writing it up, and Roshan, I'm sure when you were writing up your PhD, whatever that is, down the line, you're going to encounter this, because disciplinarity is the granting of authority from a figure that's already done this without necessarily engaging with the emotion and the emotional labor that is required in dismantling one's own subjectivity. And disciplines for the longest time within the colonial system have been, I am going to go out to the field and I will find this thing that I don't have to engage with emotionally, and I will write about it in a dispassionate, objective sense. But actually, when you're doing this autoethnographic kind of thing, and I had to make a lot of distance between what I was working on and myself, because I mean, partly just for my own sanity, I was like, oh my God, am I ready to question this right now? But I might at some later date. So anyways, I'll just stop there, because I was the other question that I was really curious to, is actually emotionally, how are you as readers reacting to this? And I don't know if Roshan wants to kick us off.
Yeah, I just remembered this little meeting that we had where I came back to you having read and I had some of the proofs ready. And I had this question posed for Daniel that I read blowjob in your manuscript. Should I proofread that to fellatio because that sounds academic? And that really comes down to the kind of techniques and traditions that we borrow from the people that we read and what is acceptable in writing, what is not. Even today, I think I need to be reminded oftentimes that I can use personal pronouns and it doesn't have to sound like it's coming from a long place of emotional distance, that it's project work that really compels me to think about, to sit with it for months, several months. And it's really coming from a place that makes me want to think, that unsettles me. And I want to speak about this, not because I'm doing a coursework or that it meets any of my academic requirements.
I guess as a reader, like, I think it was also interesting because I guess we don't know each other that well, but I do know you in a way that, you don't come across that a lot, right? Like, especially as I'm getting towards the end of my PhD, I'm only just starting to get friends who are like publishing and I'm reading their work. The last time this happened, we were doing the Kierkegaard episode with Igor, and he's a friend of mine. I've been friends with him for years, and he sent me this piece of work, and I was like, oh my God, I understand how you understand your own religion. I was like, I've never understood that in this way. So I always find it interesting to read someone's work who I know of. I know of their other work. And so I found myself wondering, parts of it just wondering how you even manage something like this. As somebody who's writing the PhD, I'm very interested in how people get from the starting idea to actually doing something in practice and then coming out with something at the end. Because a question I have, I guess, is how, when you're talking about ephemera, number one, it's hard to even find that and capture that as data and know that you want to capture that at that one time. Because there's so many times where I've been oh, I saw a tweet 2 years ago. Bye, it's gone forever. I'm never finding that again. So number one, knowing distinctly that you want to use that piece of data. And then I guess also, how do you hold space for all of that? Because when you're analyzing, I guess, just films or just other texts or just social media, when you're doing it through certain disciplines, they require you to do certain things, right? For example, I was sent social media data by some of my museums, and that's required me to redo my ethics because I never accounted for that in the beginning. And also it made me realize, do I want to go through all the effort of even doing that? You know what I mean? So I guess another question I have is how do you hold space for all that?
Yeah, I'm also curious, Paula, what was your responses to that, sort of emotionally as a reader?
For me, it was actually quite fun and comforting. So I come from history of art. So I come from a very specific field where emotions can be translated onto the page because it's a very different form of analysis and has traditionally been so since the mid 20th century. I can think of Leo Steinberg, who's a huge figure in art history. And, when he wrote about paintings, he would describe them sometimes even grotesquely because that's what he was feeling when viewing these paintings. So it was sort of a welcome back home of analysis of material. And it made me so happy to see on page because I'm still currently trying to figure out how do I evoke my own sensations when it comes to the things I'm writing on, especially when I'm writing on controversial figures and things that make people flat out uncomfortable just from the first sight alone. How do you write about discomfort? And there is a history there. There is a science there. There is a purpose for it where I think it can be absolutely irresponsible to avoid those sensations. And I think the manufacturer, the creator of the book, of the monograph, is an archivist of itself. So you have to also archive your own sensations in the pages. And I think it was done brilliantly. Yeah.
Thanks, Paula. Yeah, and Hannah, I think in many ways, and also responding to your earlier question, Paula, about pop culture and ephemera and, just holding all of these things together. I remember when I was trying to, I'll give you an example actually from the text. I was trying to think about how to talk about Tagore. For those of you, your listeners who don't know who Rabindranath Tagore is, or was, he's the first non-Western person to win the Nobel Prize, which is such an interesting category because I use that very title as a category of analysis to be like, why is this person famous outside of South Asia? What has he done? And that logic, like a Chinese poet, Feng Tang, translates Tagore's piece into Mandarin, and then that book gets pulped because they're like, oh my God, this translation's too obscene, right? So here you get like this, the first non-Western to win the Nobel Prize, which is, let's name it, a Western award, a Western-founded award. And then you get a Chinese translation that's gotten made obscene or read obscenely. And it's almost like, how do you reconcile the various things that are happening in there? So I almost like for an archive had to go, okay, what's in the obscenity law? When did Tagore become this controversy that people are pulping this poor guy's book over in China? Right? And then you look at Twitter and we're like, oh my God, every time nationalism has become a debate in some part of South Asia, Tagore's name suddenly gets tweeted and the hashtag Tagore starts trending for like 5 seconds or 2 days or whatever have you, right? And I'm like, okay, there must be a way to find how these spikes are happening. And then I looked into the software NVivo, I think it's quite popular now, to just track that. And I was like, okay, this is boring. I'm not interested in the data. I'm just actually interested in why is Tagore constantly being dragged over the coals. Then you go into the many ways in which like ephemera here is so much. It's like these university syllabuses that exist for like 2 courses, 2 semesters, and then they're gone and someone's changed the text. And I'm like, okay, I could find a PDF of that somewhere. I actually have a folder somewhere where I'm like all these university syllabus PDFs and Tagore is in all of them. And we're like, why are we reading Tagore today? Which is a question someone asked in a Guardian column. And I'm like, that's such a good question because I'm interested in knowing how this figure is being represented. Because one of the questions Feng Tang was asking is, why can't people read Tagore? He's the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize. And so I want to translate him. And in my translation, this is how it comes across. And now that's a problem for him, right? So it's almost like trying to trace these questions down led me to all of these archival places where I didn't think to look. Right? These were the questions I was like trying to figure out. In another chapter, when I was talking about this BBC documentary called India's Daughter, which deals with the rape and sexual assault on a woman, Jyoti Singh, one of the things was the contrary responses from different feminists. Like some feminists were like, oh, we can't screen this documentary in India because it's going to offend the sensibilities of people. And I'm like, okay, why? What's in the law? What is getting offended? Who is getting offended? Why are they getting offended? Because this is an outrageous thing that has happened to someone that shouldn't ever happen again to anyone. So, and then there are the other feminists who are like, yeah, this is the outrageous thing, Nevita Menon and all of these people who are like, this is an outrageous thing. This should never happen. We should know who our enemies are. In that articulation of we should know who our enemies are, that's emotion, right? Because these are the people who are oppressing me. And I need to encounter that. Because without that, I'm chasing a ghost, right? And if I'm chasing a ghost, then this is not relevant. This is not open to anyone. So I was like, I'm not chasing any ghosts. Just let's name this and let's put it down in paper. So yeah, it takes a lot of emotional work. I think one of the things that I didn't talk about, and I will when I find the courage to, is my own Christian upbringing. And the context in which I grew up in South Asia. I talk about it very briefly in chapter 1, and I'm like, okay, you know what? Actually, I'm just not ready to deal with this right now, and that's my subjectivity, just like balking at the possibility of my subjectivity investigating itself, and I'm like, I'm actually in therapy for that, but hey, I'll write about it after I finish those therapy sessions. So yeah.
Yeah, I will say, I think reading your work also encouraged me, and I think would help encourage others. When you're talking about emotion, allowing yourself to be unsettled. And I like what you've just said, about, I knew I wasn't ready to talk about that. So allowing yourself to be unsettled, but acknowledge the boundaries of what you're willing to talk about and discuss. And yeah, I think that's really helpful. And also, the other thing is I think your work encourages me to be creative and to allow myself to be pulled in one direction by the data. Sometimes I get stuck on oh, I've got all this data and I should cover all of it, and like I should make sure like everybody's voice gets a say. But I find myself being pulled by certain points of data and just even certain phrases that people say. And I think allowing yourself to creatively engage with that is really really interesting and really helpful.
This might be an interesting question, but Roshan, we've been talking about emotion in our work. Has working with Daniel and doing things together, how does that also impacted your own work? Because you're still in your master's and you've been exposed to so much stuff that I don't think I was exposed to at my master's level, which man, that's going to be an amazing thesis when you're finished.
Yeah, I feel as a starting point, let me just bring this up that my idea, my approach, I'm someone who works a lot with gender and sexuality, with queer studies, queer theory. And I've always had a very Anglo approach, always moving on to Western theory. Okay, I need to read up on Butler, I need to read up on Beauvoir, I need to read up on Sedgwick. And I think up until I actually sat down and worked with Daniel, it didn't occur to me that perhaps let me look towards my side and let me look the kind of work that is being put across. And it made me realize that all these debates that are happening around sexuality, around gender, I might have been aware about them, but I didn't realize the structure in which they came to be and how it plays out into thinking about it. And that has really changed the way for me and how I approach thinking about queerness, thinking about even methodology. As a master's student, I think this program is the first place where I've actually sat down and tried to think about what methodology I use and how I think about subjects, as opposed to just writing down an essay and thinking about queerness here and there. And this was also from my first conversation with Daniel, where I think they said that queerness is not about locating identities. It's much more than that. And queer theory stands for much more than that. And even I think right now I'm in my final semester, I'm working on my master's thesis, and that itself is again an inquiry which is not limited to sexual identity. That could be a part of it, but I'm looking at broader implications. Its implication with nationalism, its implication with neoliberalization, with urban space, with distribution of literature, production of literature, the middle brow, the upper brow, and it's a culmination of all of these things. And I think this also takes me back to the chapter that we co-wrote, and it allowed me to think about then what is unique about thinking queerness or queernesses as we put it in India, and the different kind of sociability that it shares with how structures operate in India, and which is really, I would say, unique to a particular encounter. And it's difficult to standardize, to put label on it, or to think of it in a seamless pattern, in a seamless form. It changes. It's so tangible that you have to catch it in the moment.
Oh my goodness, it's so fascinating. I'm going to have to read your master's thesis when you're done.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it was just really fun to co-write that chapter with Roshan. So this was for, what is it, Rutledge? Was it Roshan? Special issue. And yeah, we're looking forward to that coming out. But it was also like really fun to think that through with Roshan, because sometimes I'm like, as a recalcitrant academic, I have left academia, but I'm still like kind of half a foot in, or maybe my little toe is in. So I do want to do some work there, but you don't have the time because your day job is like, what the hell? Right. So just having different people to collaborate with. And I guess that's also the other cool thing about leaving academia. And we could go there if you wanted to, is kind of, you're not bound by these arbitrary notions of journals, like everything must be solo authored. I'm like, why? I do my best learning in the classroom with students. What kind of a Western centric model is this? Just to apply the methodology again, like, what's the real question here, right? What's your anxiety exactly? Is this another like old white man wanting to stamp his name on something? And do I need to apply that to myself? No, actually, thanks. Goodbye. So to me, it's really like, it's almost like a queer practice, because I'm not interested in it just being the Daniel show. That's boring. right? It could be many other things, and collaborations are like, in fact, I think that's something that I learned through Queerasia a lot. Like collaborations are just the way forward. They're beautiful, and you have no idea what will come off them. And like I think thanks to Hannah's collaborations on Queer Disrupt long ago, here we are sitting and having this conversation, and like we're in different time zones and different cities and what have you. And we were trying to do collaboration in Queerasia when Zoom didn't exist. We had this weird platform where it was like, you'd hear the speaker for 2 seconds and then you wouldn't for another 5 minutes, that sort of a thing, right? But I think, the more we're aware of the ways in which Eurocentric disciplinary mechanisms, whether they're in academia, whether they're in politics, whether they're in law, whether they're in, other structures, familial structures, tax benefits, God, ugh, right? The more they structure us, the more we can, when we recognize them, we can actually say, hang on, whose anxiety is this and why do I have to carry it?
Yeah, I guess me and Paula have had discussions about this before, maybe on the podcast, but definitely off the podcast, about, academia as a structure. Like, it's seen as this be all and end all, you know what I mean? The be all and end all of knowledge. And I've had so many, I'm getting to the end of the PhD now. I've had so many conversations with academics where they're like, are you sure that you want to go into academia? Because you don't have to, and you can always come back later if that's what you decide to do, or you can go and produce work outside of academia. You don't need to be surrounding it. So I think it's really helpful to hear from, I guess, the both of you about like how you approach academic writing, how you go through the publication process, how you enter into academia, whether that's something you want to do, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, really helpful.
I think just thinking about this weird journey, one of the things that I had to say is that to do the PhD, I figured, and to just have the space to ask these questions, to me, it was never about getting into academia. It was just about doing this research and having the space to do this research. And I think and I remember later a conversation with my supervisor, Professor Rachel Dwyer, who works in Bollywood and just an incredible force of nature. She and I were having this chat, and I was like, you would have gotten so many PhD applications. Why did you pick mine? And she's like, oh yeah, you just seemed like you knew what you wanted to do and you were talking about it in a way that seemed sensible. And I was like, okay, great, thanks very much. But it's almost like I always knew that I was interested in finding out what this thing was, because I was constantly encountering my own dissonance in many ways, and just grappling with that was part of the process. So I'm grateful for academia for having that space. But then the more I was in academia, I've taught in Warwick, and that's where we met initially, Hannah, around the time Shaumak was also there, whose book is also out, by the way, now. I just remember like, what is this? What am I doing? What is this system? And before that, in another life, I used to actually teach in Singapore in a high school. And that system also is really bizarre to me, because I was like, I have to be here for assembly at 6 a.m. Please, I can't wake up. I'm not functional before 10 after a cup of tea at least. And I'm like, this system is not built for me. It's actually not made for the work I want to do. It's not made for the ways in which I want to show up in the world. And, I'm grateful for the ways in which I could do some work in it, but it doesn't make sense. And in fact, the more, like, I think just talking a little bit about precarity, the more I notice and recognize the ways in which institutionally my body or people like me are made precarious in the institution, whether it is through systems that are constantly built to exclude us, whether it is through disciplinary mechanisms that see our work as, insufficient or inadequate, wrong readings, I don't care what you want to call it, right? Leaving academia, I think, was some of the most important and difficult decisions I had to take, but it was difficult because I'd not realized how long I'd sipped the Kool-Aid. Yeah, but yeah, let me shut up, because also I'm mindful that Roshan wants to go on to academia, and I think the one thing that I'd say is like, know the project that you want to do, and academia is a great place to do that, but like be aware of what you're walking into.
I will also say, I think it's helpful to speak about this. I get the pressure of like not wanting to put people off. When I'm not teaching at the moment, but when I was teaching, sometimes I'd go on these like rants about academia, and then I'd be like, oh my God, I've just like absolutely ruined all of these students' ideas of their academic careers. But I think, like you were saying with your project, right? It's about revealing the processes behind what is happening, like making clear normativity and normalizing functions, but you're also making clear academia is not this like super bright, fun place all the time, or it's not this like pinnacle of knowledge. And I think, you know, it's not necessarily about putting people off. It's just about letting people make their own decisions and like go into it truly knowing, you know, is this what I'm going into? Is this really what I want to do? Do I want to try it? Will the world end if I leave? All these kinds of things, right? Yeah.
There's also the financial aspect of institution where you are teaching in it, you have to serve a function and you have to say things within certain parameters because you are there to teach students because they're coughing up a lot of money or they're getting themselves into a lot of debt. And you know, I'm an American student, self-funded, so let's not even talk about my student debt. It is increasing every day, and it's not great. And then let's add on to that, you know, I'm currently teaching, and without saying too much, because I do enjoy my students, there's also that delineation between myself and them that is really uncomfortable at times, where I'm trying to encourage them to speak their mind, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's going against the norm of what they've been raised in, but I'm still the hierarchy. And you know, it's still, you know, going back to Foucault, this is a function, this is an institution, there is a governance. And we can have these conversations on this sort of platform right now, you know, 2 PhDs, like already done with a PhD, moving into a PhD, we're all sort of in an equal playing field because we're not functioning within that kind of institution. So it's one of those things, like a lot of our listeners are probably either undergrads themselves and maybe even thinking about a master's. And it's like, of course, we encourage the continuation of education. But at the end of the day, the institution in itself differs greatly with the individual, with class, with gender, with nationality, and whose passport you're holding. And, you know, I'm coming from a very privileged background, but I'm, you know, when my name shows up on a roster, it is Paola Medina Gonzalez. And, you know, that name comes with a whole lot of weight and a whole lot of assumptions even before I step into the plate. And I'm working on German studies. So I'm, you know, not the norm in my own field. And that is a blessing and it is a curse. So, you know, before I think we wrap up with the actual publication of this monograph, we don't want to discourage people from entering academia, but it is not an idyllic space. It is still an institution, and sometimes you don't get to do what you want to do within it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's the key. Systems of power, I guess, in many ways. That structure our encounter inside of it. And it's just like going in with your eyes open about what those systems of power are, or being open to encountering that encounter, even if sometimes it catches you off the back end. I mean, I said this in many ways, like about my archive, because I was like, you know, I'm actually having to straddle disciplines in order to find an archive of something that is just, it's not a archive that exists out there where I can go to and be like, oh, here's where everything is, you know.
I would like to finish up with the actual publication of the book, because it is available to buy and it's also available to download, I believe.
Yeah, don't buy the book. You can get it through a library. You know, it's a piece of work that I wasn't really thinking about what its publication will likely be. Actually, and the story here is that when I was teaching at LSE, one of the things that I was trying to do, having sipped the Kool-Aid, was find a permanent job. And part of that process was having a publication, or at least having a publication in the pipeline. Over the course of the publication being kind of accepted, I kind of decided I don't want to to drink this Kool-Aid anymore. And so I didn't bother with like sort of like saying, oh, is there a better place for this? Because that's a lot of work. And I didn't actually have the time for it, honestly. I was just trying to hold down a regular job and just do my 9 to 5, like old Dolly Parton there. And I just didn't have the time to go. And I was like, you know what? Maybe this just needs to live in the world somewhere, and someone who's reading it will like it or be helped by it or whatever. And to me, that was the driving motivation. I didn't care where it went out eventually. I mean, retrospectively, I mean, I could have cared a little more, but honestly, I was just tired fleeing that precarity that I was just like, I don't have the time and energy for it. And that's also partly when I went out to like kind of look for someone who could RA with me on the publication process, because I was like, okay, here's an opportunity that someone will be able to benefit from if they're thinking about going into academia. Because I think this is the interesting thing that we don't say much about the difference between US academia and everywhere else, actually, including the UK, is US academics are really good at parceling out opportunities to their undergrads. So when you come into an application process, and Paula, I'm seeing you nod, so like I'd love for you to say more about it, because I don't know that much. I spent a very short period of time at Cornell in one summer at the School of Criticism and Theory a long time ago, centuries ago. So when you go into an application process, you're looking at a US-based application and be like, oh, this person's done 5,000 RAs, and you're comparing that with an application from somewhere else. I'm like, they have an undergrad degree, and like that doesn't add up. But it's not adding up because the funding system in such a way is allowing US academics to do a lot more of this. And I'm like, you know what? I'm leaving academia. I don't care. I want to give out this opportunity to someone who can help it. And to me, that's my queer practice. And if they learn something and, you know, if it's part of their development process, yes, I love that. And, you know, thinking with other people is incredible for me. So I love that as well. And, you know, I put it out as a paid opportunity, and, you know, whoever took it up. And here we are, Roshan's kind of like having this chat, and, you know, has worked on getting this into publicable shape. Is that a word? I don't know. So yeah, that's where this kind of came out in the form and shape and form. But you know, if anyone reaches out and wants a PDF, just send me an email.
I love that it started and ended as a unnormative process of publishing and creating.
I was going to say, Roshan, do you have anything to say about like being involved in the process and like how it felt for you?
Yeah, I think I have recently, I would say, been very clear about wanting to join academia, being a part of the system, whatever it might throw at me. And definitely having such an opportunity crop up was amazing. It was like, you know, something that is completely catered to my interest, that is completely in my domain, that's probably something that's going to be my area of PhD is coming to me. But more than that, I feel when I first read Daniel's manuscript, I was expecting complication. I was expecting, oh, I'm going to have a hard time. I'm doing my degree, I have coursework, I also have to read someone's book, and this is someone who's been in the industry for so long. They have thoughts which are eclectic, which are refined, polished. And I think this was the first thing that I said to Daniel as well, that it was such an easy read. And everything seemed to fall in place. And the way Daniel sort of pursued the question, I feel it was relentless. They didn't allow any scope for it to slip and, you know, just disappear. So I felt that kind of a persistence is what made it simple, is what made it easy. There were perhaps no such instances, perhaps maybe just one line in the entire manuscript where I had to approach Daniel and say, okay, this is something that I would like you to expand more. I was working in the capacity of a proofreader and a conceptual editor in parts, but I didn't need to conceptually edit it. It was just proofreading here and there. And yeah, I would say having been the person who worked on this, who was the person to whom Daniel outsourced this, has really opened stuff for me. And I feel like I'm part of a network now, and I've had an early access to it. So I'm doing a course on post-colonial theory this semester, and we have a reading by Daniel, which I've read several months ago. Just it's part of Queer Asia, so I've read the book and stuff. So I just feel like I'm a step ahead. And yeah, I think this sort of a queer practice has really helped me. It has opened gates for me.
And it's been super fun for me to work with you, Roshan. I think wasn't anticipating that we'd go into writing the subsequent chapter together, but I'm actually glad we did because that was really fun to write. And I hope it was, I hope it was fun for you as well.
Yeah, I think my expectations were okay, this is again someone who's done their PhD and having to think. I think writing is not as much a daunting task for me as thinking about something. And we divided our chapter into sections, and I had finished my draft. And we had a little meeting where Daniel said that they loved what I had to say and they were really pleased. And I had this little brief moment of euphoric doubt. And I said to myself, oh, did I really write this? Did they really like what I had to say? Am I conceptually there? So yeah, I think collaborating has also teaches you so much, and really coming to a place together. And at the same time, working with Daniel, I feel I get a lot of independence to do stuff my way, and at the same time to have it fall under an organized structure, to have some sort of an organizing principle to the work.
I really, speaking to both of your points, I really enjoy collaborating with other people. Me and Paula do the podcast. I did Queer Disrupt before. I'm writing collaborative papers. Like, I don't know. I hope this conversation encourages our audience in whatever field they're in, it doesn't have to be academia, to think about this idea of collaboration. Me and Paula, I think, started the very first episode of the podcast was saying, these discussions of theory are fine on their own, but they actually really develop in conversation. And yeah, still stick by that. I was going to say, is there anything anybody wants to say? Any points? I know, Roshan, we had on the list if you want to say anything about chapter 4, because you particularly enjoyed it.
Yeah, I was actually looking forward to talking about that, particularly because I'm just going to keep it very brief, actually. But the thing with Daniel's book is that they trace the unwritten, the unnamed. There's always a chasing of the silent, something that slips. And this is what Professor Rao's personal politics, anti-normative politics does, is that they explicitly spell it out. They explicitly make it clear what is problematic. And it's actually, on the face of it, it might read as homonormativity, it might read as participating in practices of binary, in practices of heteropatriarchy, but it's really just a mockery. And I think that really changed the way that I read these encounters, and especially to sort of take a pause without assumptions, to look back and to go through the text, to sit through its connotations. Even when we read this novel, The Boyfriend, and there are instances where we look at the interaction of queerness with caste, and there's a certain privileging that Yudi, one of the character, does when he says that, oh, I do not believe in caste, and I'm going to share this piece of food with you, and I'm going to do this with you and that with you. But how that commingles then with the fetish that he attaches to Milind because of his being someone who is downtrodden. And that really plays out, I would say, very beautifully. One might think of this as popular fiction, one might think of this as literature which is not there yet, but this is the literature that is doing the work. This is the literature that is, trying to dare itself and putting itself out there.
One thing that I'd say also about chapter 4 was like I had the most fun writing that chapter. There's a subheading there, which I thought was, I had a bit of a debate, but it's the first subheading of the first subsection. It says, and it's a line from Raj Rao's novel. It says, "They lit a fire in the fucking room." Gay marriage in Indian public culture. And I think this is such a it's in a whole conversation because there are several things in that conversation. So I would say read the chapter, which I think is fun. But around the time, the Supreme Court of India refused to sort of grant same-sex marriage in some ways in within the ambit of the Indian Constitution. But it's almost like that conversation about same-sex marriage is one that really needs to be had properly within the queer community in India. Because what are we asking for? What are we're saying, yeah, we want to be same, but what are we really asking for? We're giving the power to heterosexual society to determine the conditions under which we choose to exist and celebrate our unions and celebrate our togetherness. And I have a personal piece on it and more to say on that. But one of the things that I was thinking about when I chose to, or like my partner and I sort of chose to celebrate our union, was we looked at the laws in the UK on civil partnership and marriage, and we're like, actually, marriage is burdened with Henry VIII and whoever God knows who else's problems, and I really just don't need that in my relationship. I love this beautiful relationship that I'm in, and there are many aspects of it that are like, complicated and difficult and but also easy and amazing, and I just don't need marriage to define that. And we haven't had that debate in India. So I think Raj Rao's kind of work is kind of almost lampooning the aspiration, I guess, to gay marriage, which is why he's not a popular author in South Asia. But I think he wears that with pride. He loves that. He's like, yeah, some people will get it, and the rest are, drawing rangoli with crazy cockroach lines. The thing that you mentioned, Paula, at the start. And the other thing is that they lit a fire in the fucking room. If you read the novel, the fucking room is actually a noun, not a verb. It's the room they go to fuck, because it's about purity and it's about how we see sex as impure. And I'm like, where did that come from? Whose anxiety is that?
I will say there was I think it was in that chapter, there's an interesting point around, I guess, what you've also been saying here, but when you're talking about the matrimonial adverts, and then there was that first gay matrimonial advert, which if you could in a minute, if you could define what a matrimonial advert is, because I had a certain idea and then I read the chapter and I was like, oh my God, it's not what I thought. I thought it was kind of like the, when you put in a newspaper and you're like, I'm looking for this person, but it seems like it's more a familiar thing. But the thing I wanted to say about that is, and you're kind of unpacking it and questioning it, but a thing I think a lot of people are questioning at the minute is this idea that being queer or being gay or not being straight automatically means you're a good person and you don't hold discriminatory views. And I really liked how you unpacked that. So yeah.
Yeah, and let me say very quickly in a minute what that matrimonial adult is. It's coming from to use a trigger word, tradition, a long tradition of families looking for suitable matches in its most benign form for their kids, but it's very well inbuilt into the caste system. It's very well inbuilt into the arranged marriage dynamics, and it's about transfer of wealth. Transfer of property, transfer of wealth. So that's why it's not I am looking for XYZ. It's like, here's this family looking for another family where we could be sure and safe that our traditions are safe and our intergenerational wealth is safe, and no, XYZ caste, class, gender, person is going to come and steal all of that. And I'm like, this is not centering a relationship that is at the heart of that. And, it works. For other people, it works in different systems. But here's a queer use of that's taking on all of the cultural signification that is part and parcel of the history of cultures in South Asia, where arranged marriages are part of the process. And without interrogating it, you take it on is to just, then incorporate or fold it into queerness. And I'm like, maybe it's not queer. You could say it's a gay matrimonial ad, and that's great. Good for you. But my reading on that ephemeral, on those matrimonial ads, and I think it's in this section that I talk about, casteism within Christianity as well. Now that you've reminded me, and the way which Christianity sees itself as above caste. We've changed. We have changed our religion, but actually caste is deeply imbricated in systems. So you don't need to name it anymore. It's there. It's between the lines. It's the gaps. So, that's what I was trying to do. And I hope that was in a minute.
Going to say it's very similar to my own work, where I am basically saying queerness is not inherently a good, equating to good. Queer people can be evil. There's entire works of fiction now on there's Tar that came out last year, and a lesbian conductor professor that is abusing power because at the end of the day she is still a white woman. I think it's those very obvious things that sometimes slip out of conversation, out of values, out of our structures, where no, it's just who you are, but you're still responding underneath prejudices that have either been developed throughout childhood or have just been created because of X, Y, and Z. And yeah, I think I think we're circling back to that neoliberalness of normativity, of these hegemonic structures. And yeah, it's so funny to hear oh, we've Christianed our way out of the case system. It's just I was raised Roman Catholic. I have other thoughts on that, buddy.
It's so deeply part of the structural system. And Netflix has this new well, it's not a documentary, it's kind of a reality show called Indian Matchmaking. And there are 3 seasons of it, and you should watch it. I was screaming at the television all 3 seasons. I'm like, no, what's happening? It's ridiculous. But watch it because it's so deeply structuring the ways in which we can imagine love. And I think, it's almost like the bit about queer people can be evil too. I think there's that other side of it. Let queer people show up in all their humanity. There's a shit part to it. There's a nice part to it. There's a liberatory part. But don't co-opt something that is meant to make, life easier. You can co-opt something else. Co-opt capitalism, right? I don't care about that. Go have a McDonald's. Oh, well, don't actually. BDS.
Yeah, don't.
Thank you both for being here. It was really amazing, really interesting. I hope you both enjoyed. Is there anything you want to plug before we go?
No, thank you for having us. Thank you for having me. It was really just incredible chatting with all 3 of you on this work, and I'm really looking forward to it being just out in. I mean, it's out in the world. I'm looking forward to a bunch of things coming out of this, and yeah, doing more stuff with all of you and listening to your podcast on long drives, which I got to do.
Yeah, thank you, Riti, for having me as well. And this, opened up ways of thinking about a book, and not just about what it speaks of, but about what it makes you feel and how you approach the book and how it changes your approach to reading and other kind of stuff that it leads you to. And of course, it's great being a part of the podcast, because when I was invited, I actually started listening to your podcast, and it has been a journey. And yeah, I'm loving what I'm listening right now.
Thank you all.
Thank
you. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information. And please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.